Hello and welcome to the Nutrition Digest podcast. We are your hosts and registered dietitians, Alicia Kugler, Tara Valenti, and Summer Merrick Williams, here to dish up the nutrition tea, dispel the myths, inspire, inform, and hopefully entertain. Today, we are diving deep into how much fuel endurance athletes can truly tolerate, what gut training can do, and how to navigate gels, chews, and sugar fears. So who is today's episode for? Anyone that considers themselves an endurance runner, a cyclist, a triathlete, and even hikers. Any athletes who have GI challenges during training, which is a very common issue, and anyone that's worried about sugar in gels or looking for smart fueling strategies.
Today, we'll talk about why fueling is important and is about performance and adaptation. Common mistakes such as underfueling for long sessions and mistaking hunger for GI distress. Also, how the train low trend led many endurance athletes astray, and real-world examples such as a 70.3 athlete trying to get through a 2.5-hour ride on simply a banana and water, which equals brain fatigue, brain fog, and poor performance.
But before we dive into the fueling during sessions, we need to talk about the carb loading that happens before we dive into it. Carb loading is something that many athletes have probably heard about, but not all athletes have actually implemented. And I think there's a common kind of like people are like, oh, I only need to carb load when I'm doing a big marathon or a big race. But for some athletes, it might actually be a strategy that they use for like a big weekend or really long training sessions. I know Tara and I were talking about before the call, if we have those big days on the weekend, like a really long run or really hard, like I have a lot of brick workouts where it's like 3 hours on the bike and then into like a half an hour run, and using similar strategies, but maybe a little bit modified for just regular long training. So let's clear up some confusion on what carb loading actually is. So carb loading is not just eating a big plate of pasta the night before, contrary to popular belief. I know my brother is an elite runner, and I remember when he was younger, for him, carb loading was just a plate of pasta the next day, and he had many races where he would just bonk, especially when he got into more like the middle and longer distances. By God, trying to talk to him was like talking to a brick wall. The big thing with carb loading is it's actually meant to increase your muscle glycogen stores, and that actually takes a few days, 2 to 3 days, and it is meant to maximize energy availability, delay fatigue, and to really make sure the person can perform well in events lasting longer than 90 minutes or even during sessions lasting longer than 90 minutes. It is very strategic. It's not just eating more carbs. It is increasing your carbs while you also reduce your fat and your protein intake quite a bit. Because we don't want to end up in a situation where, oh my God, I'm just eating more carbs and now I've had 5,000 calories and I feel like I weigh so much heavier and my legs are like 2 bricks and I feel gross. That's not what we want. There's a lot of math involved. There's a lot of strategy involved here. It's not just a free-for-all. So in terms of when we carb load, I know I've touched on it a little bit, but usually we talk about events that are longer than 2.5 hours. So marathons, ultra marathons, triathlons that are usually, we say from like an Olympic distance and up, depending how long an Olympic takes you. Long hikes, like say, for example, if you're going for a 6 or 8 hour hike and there's a lot of elevation, or if you have a really long bike ride, that's really common. And then say, for example, if you have like a CrossFit competition. So I know we have some listeners that are more on the CrossFit side. If you have a competition where you're doing like 6 or 8 workouts back to back to back with maybe 5 or 10 minutes in between, repeated max effort exertions, this could also be a fuel for them. I know for some people, Hyrox is another thing, or if you're someone that like you're doing a really long run, like there is some implications there because it is lasting longer than 90 minutes.
I was just going to ask, so when doesn't it work? Who is it not good for?
Yeah, so it's not good for people that have like shorter races. So 60 to 75 minutes is kind of like the distance that we really don't need to be carb loading. So say, for example, if you're just doing a 5K, 10K, say, for example, if you're just going out, you're doing like a sprint or a super sprint try, you probably don't need to be carb loading. If you have not practiced carb loading or having those days where carbs are elevated, I wouldn't suggest carb loading for the first time before your big race. Like you need to make sure you're practicing. And if you're someone that has a lot of GI issues or you get a lot of bloating from rapidly increasing your carbs, this might be something to kind of work with a dietitian to see what strategies are available to you to minimize. And there are usually some simple fixes that are there, because a lot of people end up going too high in fat, too high in fiber with carb loading. We wanted to share some stories. So I have two here. So one is I have a race tomorrow, kind of the day after we're recording this. And one of the things for me is that this race is only 60 kilometers. So that's going to take me an hour 45 to 3 hours at the most. I have no clue how the elevation is. I know there's at least one.
Is that
big
on the
hill.
bike?
Yeah, on the bike. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so knowing that it's not like a crazy long race, and I'm probably going to be finishing it under 2 hours or 2 to 3 at the worst case scenario, I don't really need to be carb loading as high as, and I know there's a lot of controversy. I was reading up about carb priming versus carb loading. Carb priming, where you're increasing your carbs the day before, and you may not be increasing at the same level as carb loading, but you're really just meant to top up your glycogen stores. And I know, Tara, you were mentioning you also do that before long runs as well.
Yeah, like every weekend. It's so on the weekends, especially during a training cycle like right now, I could be out on the trails for 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes more. And it's pretty high intensity. Like I'm running or fast hiking pretty much the whole time. And so I will intentionally shift my carb intake particularly like the night before. So like my last meal before I go out the next morning. And then morning of, I'm like, essentially like carb priming in that morning. So my kind of like go-to has been this cinnamon raisin bread that I put maple syrup on in the morning. I have 2 slices of that before I go out. And it's like a lot of carbs. I think it's like almost 50 grams of carbs in just the cinnamon raisin bread, like just one slice. And then I put maple syrup on that. So it's awesome. I feel amazing. And I know that my stores are topped off. Oftentimes the night before I'll have something like, whole grain pasta or like pizza or something that is gonna be like pretty carb heavy, so that I know that I can feel my best when I get out there and I have like all of the glycogen available to me that I possibly can have. Because I really feel the difference if I'm having like a piece of chicken and a salad for dinner the night before. Like it's not going to cut it. I don't feel as good the next day. I can't perform as well. Can't push as hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like, I think it's really important to kind of recognize like when you aren't having those carbs there, how you feel. Like I have this client who's doing an Ironman next weekend, and we've practiced some mini, like smaller amounts of carb loads for some of her big sessions. And one thing was she did kind of gravitate back towards like wanting to have a big salad with veggies the night before. And I was like, hey, we got to change that up. We have to kind of add a little bit more carb in. And so we were kind of working through her carb load that she's doing for 3 days next week leading up to the race. And our goal is between 550 and 650 grams of carbs. So to put that into context, like usually a bagel is like 50, 60 grams of carbs. A cup of rice is about 45. And so for her, like her day, it's like, hey, in the morning, we're going to have 1 or 2 bagels. We're going to have a bowl of cereal with it. We're going to have a cup of orange juice. And then she's going to have a snack. A few hours later, she's going to have some crispy mini rice chips. And she's going to have like an oat milk latte that has a little bit of like flavoring in it, like real sugar flavoring, and has like a higher carb milk. And then her lunch, we're going to have like a big vermicelli rice noodle bowl with a little bit of protein on there, keeping the vegetables on the lower side. And then the afternoon, she's going to have more toast, and she loves toast. So it's like we're going to lean into the bread for her and the rice. And we're planning to have some fun foods in there, because it can be really filling to have all those carbs. If you're aiming for 550 to 650, you can feel like the food's just sitting up here. So we're integrating things like a bubble tea that's fruit based, so that we can get a little bit of like more of the liquid carbohydrates in. And even like she's going to have some candy in the evening, because that's the way that we're going to top up a little bit of extra carb, so that she can get it all in. I know for a lot of people, they don't realize that like, hey, you try to stick to as much whole food as possible. But if you're trying to get a bunch of oatmeal in, that fiber in the oats are going to make you feel horrendous when you're trying to carb load. I know both of you have some stories of people that have gone carb loading astray. I don't know, Summer, you mentioned that you had a friend that did a 5K. Tell me about your friend.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that your client's day of eating is like my dream. So if I could eat 500 grams of carbs every day, okay, maybe I wouldn't be the happiest person ever, but it sounds amazing to me. But I did have a friend. So on the other end is kind of to your point, what you were saying earlier about overdoing the carbs and when you don't need them. So I had a friend who did a 5K and decided she needed to carb load like crazy, despite getting advice that maybe that was unnecessary. So she fully carb loaded for a few days leading up to it, big plates of pasta, pizza, all the stuff. And then for 5K, ended up having a bagel before the race and having a gel before the race started and a gel during. Needless to say, she felt energized, but totally unnecessary. And she couldn't understand why then, because she was doing so much carb loading also during her training, she was actually gaining weight as well because her demands were not meeting what she was putting into her body. She was far exceeding what her body needed for a short run. So it was just kind of the contradiction to, or the contrary story to what you guys are talking about. Mm-hmm. Really, when you need the carbs versus when you actually don't and you just kind of want to get the carbs, or you think you're working maybe harder than you actually are. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's just, we hear so often like, oh yeah, I'm doing cardio, so I need carbs, cardio, so I need carbs. And it's not just like any and all cardio. It's actually really like it's dependent on the distance. It's dependent on the intensity. There's a lot of different factors there to play. And I wouldn't be surprised if she felt pretty heavy and bloated during her race, because we know that in order to, like, when you eat carbohydrates, you also retain water. And so you can feel kind of heavy and bloated sometimes if you're overdoing it and not actually like utilizing those carbohydrates.
Yeah, she actually didn't feel very well, to be honest. And I think she was probably pretty surprised at that because she thought she did everything right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because I feel like we also spend so much time talking about how underfueling is really common in the athlete population, but there is also that other segment of people who are maybe like new to endurance sports, just getting into maybe doing like a half marathon. I've even talked to people who are marathon training who have done this, who overcompensate a little bit, and instead of eating to their needs, they eat much beyond their needs. And a lot of it is like that mental kind of like, I deserve a reward thing after like a big push on the weekend or something. You celebrate with like a giant meal, and then that turns into more food and more food and more food. And the celebration kind of just keeps going on because it's like, well, I'm running so much, I'm working so hard, I deserve this, I can eat whatever I want. And like, we want to support people in fueling their bodies adequately, but sometimes you get an undesired result, which is a significant amount of weight gain during a training cycle, which isn't necessarily going to be ideal for what you're going for.
Yeah. I know, Tara, you had another client that kind of approached it kind of like differently when they were carb loading for an event.
Yeah. So I was working with a client who was training for a big cycling event. And they, instead of like consuming carbohydrates that are low in fat and low in, well, they weren't overdoing it with the fiber. They were definitely overdoing it with the fat though, which can sometimes backfire. So if we're aiming for a high carbohydrate intake, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky because we start eating things like baked goods, cookies, pizza, croissants, things like that, which in moderation isn't a problem. But if that's what you're using for your entire carb load, you can overdo it with the fat because a lot of that stuff is very, very high in saturated fat, particularly the baked goods. And now we're getting more calories from fat than we are carbohydrates, and we're getting more total calories than we aimed for to begin with. And that's where you can feel sluggish, heavy, actually low energy, even though you've consumed so much energy. And it's just not the ideal way of doing it. And that's where it kind of gets into the science behind it and the strategy and the planning, because avoiding all of that excess fat takes a little bit of nutrition knowledge so that you can carb load properly, get the right type of calories in, and feel your best for your actual day. In this case, the person still did pretty well. Like they actually crushed it. They did really good. They didn't have any GI issues or anything, so they kind of got lucky. But in other cases, I have not seen the same result. So I would say that is one mistake to try to avoid if you're a new first-time carb loader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just kind of like wrapping up carb loading before we move on to the next topic. So general guidelines, like we want to be somewhere in the 8 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight for 2 to 3 days prior to the event. And so for an example, it would be if you weigh about 70 kilos, but 154 pounds, it would be somewhere in the range of like 550 to 840 grams of carbs, which would be the equivalent of like 10 to 15 bagels. And you want to be choosing low fiber, low fat as much as possible. So rice, pasta, cereal, fruit, bread, bagels, crackers, oats, all of those things. And you want to be making sure you're drinking enough water as well, and making sure the sodium is consistent, because carbs bind water to make glycogen. And so if you're not staying on top of the water, you might end up in a situation where you might be getting muscle cramps or excessive thirst. And you want to make sure you practice your carb loading whenever possible so that you can actually know how your body responds to different foods and you don't wing it kind of come race day.
Alicia, what's your like go-to carb loading hack? Like, what do you find you get the most of your carbs from when you have to do a carb load?
Breakfast cereal.
Nice.
Chex is my friend. I usually use rice Chex and corn Chex, and I find like big bowl of cereal, like 80 grams of carbs easily. And it's like super, like it doesn't feel heavy.
Yeah. I like liquid carbs because it's just hard to eat all of that food. And then I also use it as an excuse to eat Pop-Tarts. So I usually will have Pop-Tarts and like some kind of like sports drink, like Gatorade, something like that I wouldn't normally have, but I'll use in my training and kind of prep with it. And I find that it's less filling and kind of a treat to like drink a Gatorade. It reminds me of being a kid.
Let's talk now about carb needs by specific sport and also intensity. So to start with, how many or how much carbs do we really need? And now it depends again on your distance or your duration and also how hard you're going. So like we talked about before with kind of my friend's, in a sense, mistake is how long and how hard you're going. So if you are going at a moderate intensity, so maybe less than 90 minutes, you want to aim for about 30 grams of carbs per hour. So that's, for example, like something like a 10K run. So that's good for me because I'm training for a 10K, and I actually was just asking questions about my fueling and my training this week to these gals. And yeah, that's what I'm going to aim for moving forward with my training. Then for moderate to hard intensity workouts, so thinking about 90 to 150 minutes, you want to aim for somewhere between 60 and 75 grams an hour. And then we have our higher intensity or long duration activities. So maybe greater than 150 minutes. You want to aim for a little bit higher. So thinking between 90 to 120 grams per hour. And then for an elite edge, some athletes can now absorb 120 to 150 grams of carbs per hour. And this is via glucose and fructose blends. And you have to train for that, of course. Your body can't just naturally consume or digest a huge high amount straight away. We work towards that as our training intensity increases. So does the carbs that we're able to ingest. And as mentioned, it's going to vary. It's going to vary how well the gut is trained, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then by sport, if you think about it that way, with running, you have higher jostling, you're moving around more. So you may have more gut issues. So you may want something like a smoother gel, carb supplement, or something like that, that's easier for our body to digest. And we want to train the gut. So that's one of those sports where really practicing your fueling and what you're taking in is essential. So things like ultra events, they often include real food because you're going for such a long time and your palate may be fatigued. It's real. So you want to test out different options. So again, training your gut, training your fueling is key there. Also with cycling, it's easier digestion because you're sitting, right? You have more room for bars, solid fuel, et cetera. So I know sometimes if you're doing a triathlon, that could be a good time to get in like a Snickers bar or have a sandwich. Obviously something that's not going to smush terribly. So maybe a banana is not necessarily a good option, but you may have the opportunity to take on some real food as opposed to a liquid. And then triathlons, it's 7 a.m. Logistics matter. So plan your fuel by what leg of the race you're on. your transitions, and also your GI comfort. Again, practice, practice, practice. So how much carbs can we tolerate? Traditional guidance would say, as mentioned before, 30 to 60 grams an hour of carbs from a single source like glucose during exercise. And that's stated by the ACSM guidelines. But what about what about the longer and different types of carb loading that we do?
So a lot of the old school kind of like fueling guidelines have actually been kind of dispelled, or we've moved towards a mentality that we can have different sources of carbs. So multiple transportable carbs, so combination of glucose and fructose, which can elevate carb absorption. So we can aim for 75 grams an hour or more. And it does really benefit us from the standpoint that it uses different intestinal transporters in our body. With kind of modern protocols, endurance athletes are now consuming 90 to 120 grams per hour, focusing more on glucose to fructose. So usually we say about a 2-to-1, because fructose for some individuals does sit a little bit differently. And that's why it's important to kind of test out what works well for your body. And by doing the combination of the glucose and fructose, we're increasing oxidation and performance. And again, we want to talk about the gut training. We want to figure out what works for your body. And some more cutting edge finding shows that like elite athletes, like we've talked about like 150 grams of carbs, like, hey, some elite athletes are showing they can oxidize upwards of 180 grams of carbs an hour, which is crazy. And obviously that's a little bit like more than what the average person would need, but it's cool to see what the research is showing. And they've been kind of able to identify this through using like advanced breath testing. So the carbon method, but we're seeing more and more information coming out. So I know, Tara, we've been talking a lot about gut training and we're kind of alluding to this topic. So tell us a little bit more, Tara.
Yeah. So gut training is such a cool concept. And I think this new research that's coming out about these elite athletes being able to absorb so much and actually utilize so much carbohydrate is a really good example of how gut training can go well and how adaptable our GI tract can be. It's something that it's a relatively newer science, but we've been carb loading for a really long time and, consuming carbohydrates during exercise for a pretty long time. But back in the day, those old school marathoners, they wouldn't even bring water. Like it was crazy. So like this is relatively new. And we're learning more and more about it. And it is just a really cool science. So the gut, AKA your GI tract, is actually a trainable organ. So just like any other muscle, you're going to need to use progressive overload in order to get those adaptations that you're going for when it comes to gut training. And if you're not familiar with what progressive overload is, it's basically where you just gradually increase the challenge or the demand on something over time to create a desired adaptation. So if you're like working out in the gym and you're trying to get really big biceps, you're going to gradually increase your weight, increase your reps over time, right? So that you're able to handle more work and you see those adaptations that you want. The GI tract works in a really similar way. So with gut training, it's recommended to build up gradually. So you don't want to like just get out there and start chugging fruit juice or like chugging gels all of a sudden. That's probably not going to go well for you, especially if you have a sensitive gut. For most people, you're going to have to gradually increase the intake. And for myself, when I go through different periods of training cycles, I have to retrain my gut when I've been taking a break. So I'm coming back from injury. I spent months not doing much running at all. And now I'm back in a training cycle where I have to consume carbohydrates during my runs. And I'm retraining my gut. I have to kind of start from the beginning again, because it's something that you have to build back up to. Just like if you didn't work out for 6 months or something like that, you'd have to work your way back up. You can use different types of sources of carbohydrates. So you can test out solid foods, you can test out gels, you can test out drinks. I know that we've probably all tried different variations of these ourselves and have opinions on which ones we prefer and which ones make us feel the best. There are some key adaptations that occur when we talk about gut training. So one is an increase in gastric emptying. So basically your stomach empties itself a little bit faster. Another is an increase in transporter proteins. So if you remember from metabolic biology, there are transporters that actually transport carbohydrates into your cells. And if you are properly training your gut, we actually see an increase in these transporter proteins. More specifically, that's your SGLT1 and your GLUT5. And that's just going to help with the uptake and utilization of carbohydrates, and that occurs over time. So it's not like you eat a gel on one run and suddenly you have an increase in these transporter proteins. It's something that takes a while to kick in. So that's why we want to start training our gut several weeks before competition, because we need these adaptations to occur. And if you just go into race day suddenly expecting your gut to be ready for all of this sugar or carbohydrate, you're going to be disappointed.
Well, and that's why, like, if you think about the old mentality of like train low and then race high, that is so backwards, because you're not getting your body used to the fuel. You're not getting your body used to having that much. And you're just asking for a stomachache. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's the other thing too. That's the other adaptation that we see. If you're training your gut properly, you're going to see a decrease in that nausea, kind of like, I feel like I'm going to throw this gel back up sensation, a decrease in cramping, a decrease in bloating. Your body's just much, much more well equipped to actually handle what you're giving to it. There are some other strategies that I just want to mention for people who are trying to train their gut or might be trying to train their gut in the future. And one is strategic timing about when you actually take your gels and how you take your gels if you are a person who uses gels. I use gels and fruit snacks when I'm running. But one strategy is like, don't take your gel when you are about to do or you're in the middle of a really hard effort. So if you are running and you have a hill coming up, don't take your gel when you're running up the hill. You're going to get a tummy ache. Like, it's not a good time. You're breathing really hard and heavy, so it's hard to actually consume and swallow any kind of food. And B, doing it while you're having an intense effort is just not ideal. It's like kind of a recipe for disaster. So wait until you go on the downhill. And I would also say, if you're new to gut training, you don't have to take the whole gel all at once. You can kind of take little bits at a time, which is a strategy that I use myself. So it takes me like a few minutes to take down one of the Morton gels that I use. And I find that my body accepts that a lot better than just like chugging an entire gel all at once. So a little strategy there. In terms of progressive overload for your digestion, this is an example of just how to build it up week over week. So if you're doing your first week, you want to start with just baseline fueling. So for week 1, you're going to aim for like 30 to 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour. That would be like one banana, or one gel. And if you tolerated it well, you can progress upward. And like I mentioned before, be strategic about how you consume your gels or your carbohydrates and time that appropriately. Just use common sense there. For the product timing, when you have like your longer sessions, you can use those as an experiment. So if you have a long run or a long ride, this is a great time to test out how you're going to carb load for the race and kind of figure out what works for you. So you want to dial that in. You can do like one gel every 20 to 25 minutes and aim for 60 grams per hour, since we're now progressing. And just practice with like exactly what you would want to use for your race day and see what works well for you. For the strategy that's kind of the opposite of what Alicia was talking about, you actually, instead of training low or training light, you want to train high and then race easy. So if you train at 90 to 100 grams per hour, then when you actually go and do your race, it feels like 60 to 70 grams per hour on race day feels very light. It feels very easy to take in, and like no issues, no heaviness, no bloating, no nausea. You just feel really great and energized. So that is one strategy that can be helpful, is like training high and then racing a little bit lighter. Of course, depending on how you feel. You can try multiple formats. Like I mentioned before, you can use gels, chews, drinks, real food. You can use a combination of all of those things. Just make sure that you figure out what combination feels right for you, doesn't cause GI distress, and makes you feel the most powerful and energized. For example, you could chew on banana bread. You could sip a Morton drink mix every 15 minutes. That could be a good combination for you. These are things too that can be done in a more thoughtful and strategic way. And if you find that your system is not working, definitely a good idea to talk to a sports dietitian, aka one of us, so that we can figure out a strategy that's going to feel better for you and you can get the most out of your training and performance. Consistent exposure is essential for adaptation. So it's just like with anything else, consistency is going to be key with any kind of training, and that includes gut training. So your gut enzymes actually upregulate with consistent carbohydrate exposure. If you are not consistent, you're not going to see the same adaptations. So absolutely do not wait for race day to try high carb fueling. That would be a major mistake.
So I know, Tara, like there's a lot of controversy. Like I know every single time I open up social media, I'm hearing about sugar. And like I've had a lot of clients actually in the last 2 months come to me and be like, but Alicia, you're telling me to eat a gel. Isn't sugar bad? Or like somebody else came to me and they're like, I don't think I should be having sugar during my rides. Can you help me come up with like real food examples instead? And I'm like, whoa, where is it coming from? Yeah, I don't know, Tara, if you have.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing. And there's actually like one particular person that I keep seeing online who's like targeting gels as evil. And
have you seen that, Summer? The targeting gels? No?
Oh my gosh. It's like they talk about it like it's this what they're trying to kind of say is like the sports nutrition industry is just out to take your money, and they're telling you that you need these gels when you really don't, and they're just full of sugar and they're bad for you, and like you shouldn't be consuming them because they're inflammatory and all this stuff. But if we actually pause and use some logic here, we can think about whether or not this should actually be a concern for people who are endurance athletes or training for endurance events, even if you're not an athlete. So if we think about it, like, why is overconsumption of sugar bad for most people? Because if we have prolonged high blood sugar, that causes damage. It can cause inflammation. It can cause issues with insulin sensitivity or insensitivity. And of course, that's not going to be a good thing, right? But in the context of fueling for endurance sports, what's happening to that sugar as it enters our bloodstream? It's not causing prolonged high blood sugar. It's being utilized for energy in that exact moment. So we're not having issues with high blood sugar over a long period of time at all. We're not having issues with blood glucose spikes. We're literally using that for energy in the exact moment. We talked about those GLUT transporters and stuff. It's literally being taken up into our cells and utilized for energy. So we don't have to worry about high blood sugar for a long period of time that's causing inflammation and all of this stuff. So that argument is just not based in science. The other thing that people will say is like, well, we want to avoid eating sugar because sugary foods tend to be high in calories. They promote overconsumption, and that could cause weight gain. Okay, well, let's think about the population we're talking about here. These are people who are training for endurance events. These are people who are incredibly active. Their calorie burn on a daily basis is massive. They usually have a hard time getting enough calories. So that is another concern that is just not logical either. So when we think about how our body uses carbohydrate, muscles act like a sponge for glucose. So there's going to be little to no insulin spike when we're consuming carbohydrates in this context. So carbs before, during, and after training actually improve performance and recovery. This is like basic stuff, you guys. Like, this is not something that we need to be acting like there's controversy or confusion. It's like old science. This is not anything new. We know this. And we know that if you're consuming carbohydrates during, before, and after your training and competition, it's going to make you a stronger, healthier, and more fit person. So I don't really see anything wrong with that. Do you guys?
Not at all. And
No?
I think it does come back to, what we were saying earlier. I think there's a misconception sometimes for some people who are not endurance athletes, who are doing a lower volume of training, who think they're doing endurance. And it's not for any fault of their own. I'm in that category, right? I don't do longer events, but I do think there is something to be said about people in this realm who are or new to sport or new to endurance training, where even a 5K, that's really hard. Like a 5K is really hard for me. And so my perceived exertion to me or to someone else who's newer to this type of sport may feel like you need to do carb loading because it's so challenging and you think you're working so hard, and you are, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to carb load. You may need to fuel smarter and fuel differently. So again, just to kind of, bring it back, this is for endurance athletes. This is for longer distance and longer duration and higher intensity athletes, not for our, 5K, maybe 10K, shorter duration athletes.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is consuming the appropriate carbohydrates for the individual. And that needs to be tailored person by person. So for someone like you, Summer, having some carbs before you go out on a run, because it's going to be a hard effort for you, is absolutely great. That's advised. That's a good idea. You want to make sure that you have that energy ready to use for your run. But you're right. Maybe like doing a full-blown carb load and like eating a bunch of gels when you're not running for a very long time is not going to be ideal. That's not the proper amount of carbohydrate for you. So it needs to be tailored to the person. And if you have your carbohydrate intake tailored properly, we don't have any of these concerns about blood sugar spikes or, insulin issues or all of that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for a lot of people, it's also not understanding like what the best sources are. For a lot of people, it's very confusing. They're like, oh my God, okay, now I hear I'm doing these endurance events. I'm training for this. And I am the person that they're speaking about that should be doing this. And then they're like, they get to the gels or they try to figure out like what to get. And they're like, oh my God, there's so many. And it could be very, very confusing. And the big thing is trial and error, and trying to figure out what works for you, like looking for a gel the thing with gels is they are faster for gastric emptying. Usually the osmolality, so the amount of water that it pulls into the gut, is a little bit lower. Martin gel, for example, is one that's unique in that it uses a hydrogel formula that actually minimizes a lot of gut issues. So a lot of people find that that's a good one. For other people, they want something that's going to be flavored really nicely, because you can end up with a lot of flavor fatigue when you're on a longer bike ride or things like that. So when we look at like different forms of fuel, like we have gels, they're going to be the most convenient, but they do need water. So that's the big thing that a lot of people don't realize is make sure if you're having a lot of gels, we're sipping on water too. There's liquid gels as well. So they're the ones that have a lot more fluid. So they're easier to digest. And so like an example would be GU Roctane. Chews are another one. So Clif Blocks is an example. I know I use those when I'm cycling because I find they're really easy and I don't necessarily have to worry about like ripping a gel open. I just already have it open on my bike, ready to pop in my mouth. And then liquid carbs provide a lot of like really, really quick fuel and carbs. So Scratch and Tailwind are examples. And then if you're looking at like real food itself, there is some examples. Like I have a lot of friends that are leaning towards like the maple syrup gels or the honey gels as a fuel source. For other people, they try dates, dried fruit, banana bread. I know jam sandwich is another one. I've done that on the bike. And Tara, you were talking about fruit snacks. So that's a great example. Even like Welch's, like those kind of ideas. I love that. And I know the running community is going crazy about the nerd clusters. Mm-hmm. I've personally never had them, but I know everyone is going crazy about it.
And Rice Krispie treats. Krispie treats are like the thing right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's actually my client that's doing the Ironman. That's exactly what she fuels on the bike. It's just easy for her. Yeah. And even when you're looking at gels themselves, there are a lot of variety of gels. Like when you're looking at the fruit-based ones, Huma is a brand that it has chia seed and fruit puree. And so it's going to be really smooth digestion. There's ones that are honey-based. So the honey stingers, there's the maple syrup one, like Kronos, Endurance Tap. There's the hydrogels that we discussed, the Martin. There's the caffeinated ones too. So if you're looking for something, there's lots of different ones that you can find that have caffeine in them. And then that's going to be kind of like something to look at. And then there's ones that also contain electrolytes. Just be mindful if you're doing an electrolyte one that we're not overdoing electrolytes in your water as well. We want to really be thinking about it. So it's kind of thinking about like what works for you and trying the best. So Summer, I think you're going to be wrapping us up today and talking about how do people know if they fueled enough?
Yeah, that's a great topic because sometimes we don't know what's enough. I've been asking you guys this question too. So one thing you could do is, kind of self-assess, right? So here's a checklist for kind of a real-time self-assessment. So during training, how are you feeling? Are you fading mentally? That may mean that your fueling may be too low. Is your rate of perceived exertion, your RPE, is that climbing, but your heart rate is stable? That may mean that your carb stores are likely depleted. Also, did you stop sweating or are you starting to feel chills? That may mean that you're underfueled. And also, are you peeing excessively on long runs? That may mean that your fuel or your fluid is mismatched, right? So we're just not having that right balance of how much fluid we're taking in and how much fuel we're consuming. And then after your workout, thinking of noticing, do you have severe hunger later, like after you're done? That may show that you're underfueled and you didn't eat enough or consume enough before your run or sport. Also, how did you sleep? If you have poor sleep, it can indicate that you had a cortisol spike from having a low glycogen levels or having low glycogen levels. And also, if your fatigue is lasting over 2 days, that absolutely can indicate suboptimal fueling. So thinking about what did I eat before or during my training session? How was my energy? How did my gut feel? And would I repeat this strategy for race day? And if not, what would I change next time? So definitely, again, I keep harping on practice is key. Train your gut, train your fueling strategies. And that's going to be the best way to not only, fuel for success, but know what works for you personally.
So in terms of our key takeaways today for our very carby topic, endurance fueling can absolutely be trained. It's just like fitness. So we want to focus on progressive overload for training the gut. We want to really target foods that feel good for us, eliminate foods that don't, and just create a really dialed plan for the carbohydrate consumption, whether that is carb loading before an event or during your training and your actual effort. 90 to 120 grams per hour is achievable with consistency and variety. Fear around sugar is often misguided when applied to athletics specifically. So if you are seeing information out there that is making you feel like you should not be consuming sugar during your sport, maybe just second guess the source that you're paying attention to. Feeling well is essential to performance, recovery, and health. For this week, try increasing your carb intake during your next long run or ride by 15 to 20 grams per hour and just see how it felt. Just give it a shot and see how your body accepts it. If you have nutrition questions for us, send those to nutritiondigestpodcast@gmail.com. We are happy to address your questions during the podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on your weekly nutrition digest. And show your support by sharing or giving us a sparkling 5-star review.
Thank you for tuning in.
We'll see you soon. Hey guys, Alicia, Tara, and I just realized that we forgot to tell you about something that we created specifically to go along with this episode that we wanted to share with our listeners. And that's the Carb Loading for Race Day Guide. It's filled with a lot of information from this episode, as well as more specifics to dive deeper into what it takes to fuel for a race. So we'd love to share this with you. And if you'd like a copy, please send us your email address to nutritiondigestpodcast@gmail.com or DM us at The Nutrition Digest, and we will send you a copy.